you can see our studio audience here.
Yep.
And they will be bugging you with questions throughout the presentation. And we will just be going live on as soon as I can find it. Live on the various streaming platforms, because we usually have a few people watching from them as well, but not really taking part in the same way. There we go. So while I'm just getting all of that set up, I don't know if you managed to see any of the videos, but welcome to Cyber Cafe Sci. The Cafe Sci, or Cafe Scientific movement, is an open science movement to promote conversation about science rather than the normal lecture format. So bringing it out of an academic format and basically handing it over to the public, who will then ask incredibly simple questions that a lot of people didn't really think about in academic fields, or sometimes just very simple questions. So we get a lot of dialogue usually, and that's basically the point of the movement. When lockdown happened, we went from running a regular Cafe Sci at a wine bar to a online one, because there was that opportunity, and that meant we also took the opportunity to go with this type of event where we can get someone from all the way across the ocean, where we suddenly need to worry about daylight savings and time zones and so on. I am thinking for the next one, or for future ones, I'm just going to say we're all using UTC, live with it. But yeah, see how that goes. So for those in the audience, raise your hand if you have something that you need me to message you about, whether it's a technical question or something you'd like just to one side. Otherwise, you can ask questions through the Q&A panel. I realise my pointing off to the side here makes no sense to any of you, but I have a second monitor here with the Q&A panel up, so I will see questions and will rudely interrupt Jenny during her talk to bring those up and pass them over. And without further ado, I will spotlight you, and then it's all down to you.
All right.
And you're
Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I'm really excited to be talking about science education today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And to start out with, if it's all right with you, James, I'll just give a quick introduction about how I got the name Science Mom, because as you may have guessed, that is not my real name. When my son was in second grade, his teacher happened to tell me that she had had to drop a lot of the science curriculum from her class because of the new testing requirements that we had in the US that put such a heavy emphasis on teaching to the test and making sure that kids were getting their reading and math scores to where they needed to be. And this kind of broke my heart. I was like, how can you drop science? That's like the best part of school, in my opinion. So I volunteered to come in once a week and do a hands-on science demonstration, something really exciting and engaging for the kids. And my name changed from Andrew's Mom to Science Mom, and it stuck. Within a year, I was visiting a dozen classrooms a week, and I loved doing it so much. I decided, you know what, I want to flip things. I want to make this hobby, this outreach that I do, I want to make this into my true career. And so I started a YouTube channel and have had that going for just over 3 years now. And before COVID, I would visit a lot of elementary schools doing engaging science demonstrations. And in a nutshell, one of the most important things to me about teaching science is to make sure that kids understand that it's more than trivia. Because sometimes science is presented like, you know, here's a big list of terms and facts that you need to know. And if it's not presented with investigative thinking and showing the puzzle piece aspect of it, that, you know, we have ideas about how the world works, and then we are experimenting and we're reevaluating our ideas as we gather new information. If you don't have that aspect, then it can be a dry topic. But if you introduce the scientific method into it, it, in my opinion, is one of the most engaging and exciting topics. And so that's really what I'm passionate about. And in a nutshell, that's me, and that is what I do. So, James, I wanted to know, do you have any questions for me that you want me to address?
Yeah, I do actually. So you've mentioned that passion for science. Did you have that before you started doing this, or was it more science is just there before you started talking to children about it?
That's a good question. I guess I should have started before, before my son's second grade class. I have always had a love for science. So when I was a kid, I was the type of kid who was always outdoors catching bugs, trying to identify plants, and doing little science experiments in my own backyard. And when I went to school for college, science had always been my favorite topic, and I knew that I wanted to go into the sciences. But the real difficult question was what field, because they all looked great. I took 5 years to complete my bachelor's, mostly because there were so many electives that, other classes that I wanted to take. I didn't want to only study crop science. I also wanted to take anatomy and physiology and all these different classes. And I got a master's degree in plant science with an emphasis in molecular biology. So that's my science background, is primarily on genetics. My master's project was trying to track down a gene that's involved in stress-induced flowering. So if you stress plants, they'll flower sooner. And the idea was, if we can understand on the molecular level why that happens, if we know what genes are involved, then that could potentially have a lot of impact with agriculture, and we could better understand why sometimes this phenomenon happens. So that's my background.
It's funny, actually. One of the earliest talks that we had was with Fronds with Benefits, or Bethany Nichols, who's also very much into plants, but she mentioned that insects attack flowers in order to get them to flower early, so that they can get to the nectar. So it's interesting that you were on that area as well.
Yeah.
Chris has just asked if you had a science background. Obviously, you've sort of covered that now. I'm curious, did you use that science background before this? Was it a profession, or was it something you went through university to learn and then didn't use? Or
so in terms of my work experience, I paid my way through college fighting wildland forest fires, actually, and working for the Forest Service. So during the summers, I got paid to hike. And if there were fires, Type 2 crews would get put together, and we would go out for 2 weeks at a time fighting wildfires. And then during the academic year, I had this very more cerebral, less physical work of being a student. And I really enjoyed that balance back and forth between the two. But then when I finished my master's degree, I actually defended my thesis 4 days before our first child was born. So I was very pregnant and about to pop with a baby. And then after our first child was born, I stayed home for 7 years with our kids when they were really little. We have 3 kids. And so I took a break from the workforce for that time. But while I was, taking a break, it's always been my favorite thing. My parents lived in China for a couple of years, and my dad's always had a subscription to Science and Nature. And so as soon as they said they were going to China for 2 years, I said, well, what about your Science and Nature subscriptions? Can you just have them go to our house instead? And he said, sure. And I enjoyed reading those when my kids were little, kind of browsing through and just trying to keep in touch with, what type of research is happening and what are some of the exciting things going on.
Sounds really good. And so now, obviously, you do these presentations to school children in the US rather than in the UK, but you never know. How easy is it to get them engaged in science? I know that there's a lot of I hear talk about, oh, I hate maths, or I can't stand science. It's really difficult. And I do wonder how much of that is the way it's taught, or just because trying to teach it the way that schools do is much harder than saying this bit is fascinating.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the way it's taught. And unfortunately, especially in the US, hopefully we don't have this problem in the UK as much, but when we focus so much on end results and test scores, it's really to the detriment of both the teachers and the students, because learning is so much more dynamic and interesting and engaging than just a test and the result from a test. That's really just a small portion of the learning experience. And so in the US, I've taught before to kindergarten students as young as 5 years old. And I'll never forget one of my first demonstrations. I asked if any of the kids had something they wanted to share, something they learned. And a little 5-year-old girl said she learned science was amazing, and she never thought she would think that. And I was equal parts gratified and horrified, like grateful that I had been a spark to awaken, curiosity and love for science, but also just kind of crushed that at 5 years old, she would have developed this preconception that science wasn't for her. And I think when people, especially with math, I think there's a lot of early negative experiences that sort of just get this fixed mindset that it's too difficult, and that's unfortunate.
I mean, my specific area isn't science, but we do get a lot of people in my area saying, oh, I don't do computers, I don't get computers. And I think there's almost this narrative running through with certain subjects where people are told it's boring, it's dull, it's hard, you shouldn't be interested in it.
Yeah. My main focus, and I see we have a question here about specific curriculum topics, and I'll say that my main focus has always been on making the learning experiential and hands-on learning. So when I go and I do science demonstrations, I'll try and pick things that use household objects, and then encourage the kids, like, this is something that you could do too. This is something you could try at home. And I think that once you make it experiential and hands-on, especially, the elementary, the K through 5 is sort of where my heart's at in terms of science education, but that makes a huge difference. And then another follow-up question I see here in our chat is, do you think that girls and minorities are unduly influenced against science? I think it's getting better, but I think there is a bias in it. A lot of it is just as simple as the fact that there are very few minority role models. I remember last year an assembly that I did where they knew a scientist was coming in, but they didn't know anything else. And when this group of 5th graders walked in, one of the girls just shouted out and exclaimed, "Oh, it's a girl! It's a girl scientist!" And, apparently to her, when they said scientist, she just assumed male. It had to be a boy. They would not have a female scientist presenting. And so that small little bit of the fact that I am a science mom, and I'm coming in as a female, I think that helps young girls feel like science is more accessible to them. And then we've got some great African-American and other role models in science as well. And I really love, someone asked me, like, do you feel like there's too many science communicators and that you're competing against each other? And I don't think that at all, because the way that I teach science and present it is really going to resonate with some people, but not so much with others. And I think the more role models we have and the more diversity we have in our role models, the better.
We've actually just had a question coming in from Twitch, because I have the other streams up on the side and I want to get this one there. So they've asked, is this live? Now, admittedly, Twitch is on about 5-10 seconds delay, so they won't see the answer for a while. But if we can just prove it to them, that will hopefully help.
Yep, it's live.
Yeah, so we've got a watcher there. And now Chris has said he's worked with women scientists and engineers a lot, but almost never taught any. Actually, are you happy if I bring Chris on to quiz a bit about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while we're bringing Chris on, I'll just say that I was one of only 2 female undergraduates in crop science. I mean, it was almost all male. And I took Harvard has a cognitive bias test where you can see what your bias is about gender and science. And when I took the test, my bias was so strong. But my husband, who's a mathematician, when he took the test, he didn't have much bias at all. And I said, well, I think that's just because you're not aware of it, because you don't experience it. Whereas I was given the message, kind of subliminally through all my classes, being one of the only females, this is not a female realm.
Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, I found this fascinating for years, because when I was at school, girls were much better at maths and science than I was, but they were depressed because they didn't get 100%, whereas I wasn't. But my professor at university was Stephanie Jackson, who was England's first female professor of physics, and that might have influenced me a little bit by sort of normalizing it. I've never quite understood what it is that stops girls from becoming interested in science and engineering. When I meet them, and I've been lucky enough to work quite a lot with women in science and engineering, I don't know why, it just so happens, they've always been extraordinarily good at it, probably because they've made it through the filter. But it's my beginning was in the 1980s, and we're now in the 2020s. And it still seems the same. And I used to teach courses in industry, and I've taught, I don't know, we must have taught hundreds of engineers together, haven't we? And I could, probably a handful of them were women, and almost all of those were in China, where there isn't the same differentiation, not to the same extent at least.
Yeah. And I think engineering in particular has more of a gender difference than other fields. And if anyone's still wondering if it's live, here's evidence, because my daughter has a question.
Hello.
It's a live stream right now, okay?
Fame at last.
I just got our puppy to sleep.
Here, go.
Don't even
It's okay. We just got a new puppy and she's nervous that he'll wake up, but I assure you he will be fine.
Okay, he won't wake up. Yeah.
And to the topic we were just discussing, sure, there is not any innate reason why you should see this discrepancy between minorities and women in STEM. But I think a lot of it is messaging that comes out early on from lack of role models. And then I think, unfortunately, there are some biases that teachers and presenters have. And so, when you have girls being told, like, oh, you'll never do well at math, or math's not for you, messages like that, in middle school tend to stick. So I think that
in the States, you have like is it the GRA or the GRE you have to pass before you can go to a graduate student? I don't think we have that, thank goodness. But that's kind of a test. And I do remember in the 1980s when I worked for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham in the computer department, we had an interesting situation where we had 15% Black in the local community and 0 in our computer department. We argued very strongly that we had psychometric tests, profiling, aptitude tests, which were perfectly objective. But somebody came in and showed us that absolutely they weren't. There was some kind of cultural bias in them, which meant that our local, particularly our local Black community, were automatically excluded. And I was too young and naive to take a lot of interest beyond going, wow, that's appalling. I didn't really look into what it was exactly. So if you have an objective test where we think that we're testing you on something like computer science or on physics, how is it that a cultural or gender bias actually creeps into that? Because I don't quite understand it, although I know it must happen.
I saw some interesting research recently that middle school is where and I can speak more to women in STEM than I can minorities in STEM, just because I've researched that more. But middle school is where you really see the divergence. In elementary school, things are fairly even between male and female. And then in middle school, a lot of it is just the social messaging that, this is not for girls, that has a big effect. And then the scores drop off and the exposure drops off as well. So I think it's primarily a social problem, but I do think you're right that the only way to fix biases is to be aware of them. And that can be a hard thing, especially with aptitude tests and other things.
Don't worry about the puppy. We've had an incident before where someone's dinner was set on fire. So dealing with the puppy is fine.
Yeah, that was a very funny one, wasn't it? We need to invite Ken back so he can set fire to the dinner again. That would be quite good. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's interesting.
Right, I'm just going to de-promote you again so you can go back to being an attendee. And we've got a couple of questions in. One of them is, what sort of equipment do you use for experiments? Is it mainly stuff found around the house?
It mainly is. And we just completed, we did, we just did 52 science lessons that we live streamed through the quarantine. So from COVID-19, when things were first shut down, we started live streaming, and I did a lot of experiments in those 52 lessons that just use household ingredients. And one of my favorites, actually, I have a YouTube series called Science Mom's Guide to Water, and it's a 7-part video series where we just go through and teach cohesion, adhesion, surface tension, all of the properties of water using simple experiments that you can do at home with pretty basic supplies. And to follow up on Sarah's next question, what's the best way to encourage children to enjoy science? I really think it's to share your own curiosity and wonder, because curiosity is contagious. And if you are showing them something and you're genuinely excited about it, I think that helps. Or if you can find a science presenter who is genuinely excited about what they're doing, I think that will instantly kind of spark their own curiosity and enthusiasm. And then don't be afraid to let them get dirty. For the water series that I do with the water experiments, a cup and a screen and a couple lids. During bath time, if you say, here are some science experiments you can try, and then you don't have to worry about water getting everywhere, that's a great way to bring in some science. There are all these opportunities to bring it in everyday life. And I think if you just start encouraging them to ask questions and then allowing them the space to make mistakes, because science is all about making mistakes. And when they set up their first few experiments, if they have ones that don't turn out, instead of being like, oh no, it didn't work, use that as a teaching moment to be like, ooh, why do you think it didn't? And could we try it again in a different way? And Sarah asked, my YouTube channel is Science Mom. So if you Google Science Mom, it'll come right up.
Yeah, we're just about to tweet that out. Also, if you can do good science with ordinary equipment, why do we look so much at specialized equipment at schools?
That is a really good question. And I think at schools, there are two difficulties that I think teachers face at schools. And I think it's time and cost. And the time component is big, because a lot of science experiments that use, even ones that use ordinary supplies, like my water series, if you have 20 students in a classroom and you want to get them all set up with little tubs and water and lids so that they can try a science experiment, that's going to require quite a bit of time and some mess as well. And I think that, I don't know why more people don't do the ordinary experiments, because in my mind, they're the best because they're most accessible. But I will say some of the specialized experiments that have been around and are really popular, they're just very exciting. Like, taking dry ice and making dry ice bubbles. That's one of my most popular demonstrations. Dry ice is not that readily accessible to most people, but seeing those bubbles fill up with white fog and then, burst is super exciting for the kids. And so it's one that's in my cadre of favorite demonstrations.
Since you mentioned dry ice, do you have any idea how I can get hold of some liquid nitrogen for ice cream experiments?
The first thing you need to get liquid nitrogen is the world's most expensive thermos. At least here in the US, they will not give you liquid nitrogen. There are plenty of suppliers. Any major city will have a supplier where you can get liquid nitrogen. But if you show up with just like a Tupperware container, they'll laugh at you and say, go away. So you have to have a Dewar. I have one in my closet right here. Do you want to see it? I'm sure you've seen it.
Please. I've not seen it on computers.
Oh, I will grab it. It'll take just a second. All right. This is a Dewar, D-E-W-A-R. And this one holds 10 liters of liquid nitrogen, and it does not seal, because liquid nitrogen is always expanding into a gas. And so if this lid sealed tightly, then you would have an incredibly violent explosion. So on top here, we have just a little foam insulator that fits down in the neck. And then inside, you have a smaller container that holds the 10 liters. And then in between that smaller container and this outer part is a vacuum, so that it insulates it as much as possible. And if you fill it up with liquid nitrogen, it will last, it depends on what temperature you're storing it at, but it'll last a month and a half or so before it all sublimes away or evaporates away and turns into a gas. But then that's what you have to get liquid nitrogen.
So particularly relevant for people in the UK, and we have got a question that I'll get to in a second, but for people in the UK, really important question. How much does a flask of liquid nitrogen like that cool down your house for that month while it lasts?
Barely any.
Right.
The Dewar does a very good job at insulating that liquid nitrogen, and it turns into a gas quite slowly. But yeah, if you want to cool down your house, liquid nitrogen is a very expensive and inefficient way to do it.
Not a solution to the current weather over here then?
No.
How do you fit in the Science Mum work with the teaching curriculum?
That is a great question. I do. So in the United States, we recently, they came out with Next Generation Science Standards, is the new teaching standards that they have. I do try to look for connections, but my primary goal with the lessons that I put together is that they are engaging, that they evoke curiosity and spark a love for learning. And so I designed them primarily around that, and then I will look afterwards and see if they connect to Next Generation Science Standards. And some of mine do, and some of them don't connect all that well. I think too many people in the US confuse the standards for curriculum, and they're a little bit hard to read, and they don't really flow in a good curriculum format, in my opinion. Apologies if anyone who created those standards is watching, but that's my honest opinion.
I think we're probably safe. So we know how you got into it. We know why you do it. obviously it is getting curiosity going in children. I mean, I'm still convinced cats are better than dogs because cats are more curious. So curiosity is, I'm sold on that. How's it going in general? I mean, is it successful? Is the sort of view of it, is the appetite for it improving? Is it growing?
Well, I think if you have something that you're passionate about, and I think this applies to more than just science communication, but if you have a message that you're passionate about, if you want to make a living essentially communicating that message, it's not an easy career choice. So I started my YouTube channel 3 years ago, and just within the last 6 months, I finally got to a place where I'm not operating in the red in terms of, being able to afford my camera equipment. And so it's a struggling career in terms of just being able to support yourself and pay the bills. And I think it's important for kids to know, especially because YouTuber has become such a popular career choice. It's important for kids to know that if you want to grow up and have a career as a YouTuber, you better plan on having, 3 to 4 years where maybe your parents are paying your bills before you actually are self-sufficient. There are exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, it takes a lot of time to build up an audience and to be able to find the support that you need.
It's taken me this long to realize, by the way, that that's actually a backdrop and not a virtual background.
It is. It's a vinyl cloth hanging. I should adjust the screen slightly so you can see that we're actually on the moon.
Really, there should be a flag somewhere there, I'm sure. Right. You started out in plant science. Obviously, demonstrations, chemistry is always going to lead the way because chemistry is easy and fun.
Yes.
How much have you branched out beyond plants chemistry? Can you get people or children involved in the more abstract stuff? And if you can, how?
Oh, that is a great question. So I would say for sure chemistry and physics are like the star sciences for demonstrations, because so many chemistry and physics experiments and demonstrations are very visual and very eye-catching. But genetics and biology have just as many fascinating topics. And I think the way to do it is to try and incorporate stories. So, look for a question that has an answer that is like a miniature story. And that's what I try and do when I'm teaching those topics that may not be quite as dramatic visually. I look for stories and questions that are interesting. So, I always bring in the Romanovs when we talk about genetics and talk about how, would you believe that a mutation toppled an empire? It really did. And sort of just kind of go through that real life history story.
Okay, so you're not just looking at a narrative of here's a mutation that happened in a plant. You're saying here is a very human, massive historical event that I can tie it to.
Genetics. Yeah. Or, and for younger kids who might not get, they might not have their ears pop up at, a real life history lesson on Russia. For younger kids, I fictionalize it a little bit. So I'll do a little lesson about a bug village, and, they're getting invaded by slugs. But if there's this double recessive, super bug that comes out, that the village will be saved. And then, I have them do a simple Punnett square, like, is there going to be a super bug with this cross? Can you figure it out? And just that little puzzle piece of it, and then the fun details about the super village or the super bug, tend to really get them engaged.
We've just had a pile of questions come in. So from Chris, I know that he's peripherally involved with homeschooling his young grandchildren, and by peripherally they live together, but he only gets involved when it's a subject he's interested in. He finds it hard, despite looking at the national curriculum and studying it. I don't know if you have an equivalent in the States. There must be some sort of curriculum,
we do.
But yeah.
Yes.
To understand how it works and what its aims are, do you find the same in the States?
Absolutely. So, and I have to tell you, Chris, the first time that a teacher showed me the Next Generation Science Standards, this was right after they had come out, and she said, for second grade, we have the standard on light. Can you help? And I thought, oh yes, the physics of light is amazing. And I started reading the standards, and I've got a master's degree in molecular biology. And I sat there for about a half hour thinking, what in the world are they trying to tell me? And I'm a little bit better at trying to figure out what their aims are now, but it still is tough. And I think it's just an artifact of, death by committee. Like if you have a standards coming out of, a whole bunch of people arguing over what should be in them, I think a lot of times you end up with something that is dense and difficult to read by the end. So it can be difficult. My approach has been primarily to look at just kind of the core topic. So light is fascinating. And, we can do things with, like making a rainbow and then doing the reverse, blending colored light to make white. That's really visual and fun. We can do photo paper. We can talk about UV light. I can bring in a scorpion and show how a scorpion glows under UV light differently than under regular light. So I look for like, okay, I've got these fun, really dynamic investigations. And then I try and present it first and foremost in a way that will excite and engage. And then I sort of look to the standard and think, all right, I'll try and check a box if I can. And that usually works better for me to sort of go backwards.
And there's an elaboration from Chris, and this is on something which I've spoken about with him before, and I will quite happily go on rants about. The national curriculum over here certainly is lists. It's lists of things that you have to learn, and there's no hierarchical structure to it. So it's not building on what comes previously. What he's looking for is more ordering relationship between topics and a hierarchy of required knowledge with an eventual practical name or aim. I'd love to do a whole session on curriculum and the way it should be structured and so on, and I'm happy to talk about it more and would be really interested in your views on it, but I will get very ranty and shouty if we go down that route. So I might go on to Sarah's topic, which is more immediate. My daughter's homeschooling her children and I help. At the moment, we're struggling with finding a curriculum and are wondering if we should just do fun things and be led by their interest until we reach Key Stage 4, where they have to start passing exams, or will this disadvantage them because they lack the groundwork? And just to go on and do a personal experience thing on that, until I did my master's, I was convinced education was just teaching me facts. And that includes when I was doing a bachelor's degree, which I left because it was just more information. Then about 10 years after I left university the first time, I went on and did a master's and suddenly discovered it's about thinking about things and pursuing things and researching and learning yourself. It's not just a load of facts that get thrown at you. So I know my answer to that question of whether it would disadvantage them or not because they lack the groundwork in the curriculum and so wouldn't necessarily be able to pass exams. I'd be interested to know yours because I know over there you've got similar standardized testing approaches to things in formal education.
We do. And I have to say that trying to just force facts on a young mind is not an effective method of instruction. And too often, I think teachers feel pressured to do that because of the tests. Like, okay, here are these facts you need to know. I need to make sure they get in. But the experience of learning, and this question you ask about kind of following their interests, if it's sort of that proverbial, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That really is at play here. If you can teach a child how to love learning and give them tools so that they can explore, that's going to be much more beneficial in the long run than focusing on facts in preparation for a test. Having said that, if you're homeschooling and you know that these exams are going to be an important part of your child's life, you don't want to just completely set them by the side. But, and Chris, I love this follow-up here about what children can understand. I really believe that too many people treat children as if they are inferior creatures. And that's one of my passion topics, that, children are people, just like you and I are people. They are younger people and they don't have as much experience as adults, but they are much more capable of understanding complex topics than we often give them credit for. And I don't shy away from using more advanced vocabulary when I teach. I just try and make sure that I repeat it because that's really part of the learning process. When you hear a new word, you need to hear it multiple times before you're able to really contextualize and understand it. So I would say focus primarily on interests and teaching them how to learn. You're not going to be disadvantaged because of that. But I would also be aware of what the main topics are on the exams that they're going to have coming up, and just try and make sure that some of those areas overlap with what you're doing.
And again, I'm going to go personal on that one. Right at the beginning of lockdown, I was involved in something called Cyber School, where we were doing various security things for kids, and I wanted to do cryptography and did. And a lot of people kept on telling me that the Caesar cipher, which is a very simple cipher, was too complicated for the age group. By the end of it, I was getting emails and tweets from children who wanted to know more about modern asymmetric encryption, under 10 years old, and wanting to understand PGP and how the mechanics of it work and the mathematics of it. So I think we do underestimate children a lot. We've also got a question on Facebook, and this one's, I think, is particularly interesting. So moving on from kids, how about getting adults interested? So people who've gone through that experience as children of, oh, this is too hard for you, you should focus on other things. As an adult, Marion finds that things aimed at kids are plentiful. There's a lot of them out there, they're very good, but there's not so much aimed at adults, aimed at people who are more advanced in having a grounding elsewhere and want to develop that and want to be inspired by topics.
That's a great question. I think particularly in math, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, if you had not done well in math and now, you know, suddenly realize, oh, I want to be an engineer, but I need to go back and get these math skills as an adult. It's important to recognize that there are certain topics that are hierarchical, where there's a base of information that is essential to understanding the next level, and then that's essential to understanding the next level. And I would say if the topic you're interested in is one of those, just don't be afraid to go down to that, wherever you need to go to that bottom level. You know, if you never learned how to properly convert fractions and you want to be an engineer, you've got to brush up on fractions, and that is perfectly okay. My husband always likes to say anyone can do math. It just takes some people more practice than others. And I think that's entirely true. In terms of resources for adults, I hope that our channel is a good one. And I think other science educators that speak to kids but don't do so in a condescending way, I think what they're really trying to do is, and my goal is that it's accessible to kids, but also to anyone who needs to come in at an entry level that doesn't have a science background, that they'll be able to learn. I hope that answered your question. If not, feel free to clarify.
Yep, they can always post up on Facebook again. I'm just going to share your channel there since it was part of the answer. Right, so another one. I think we both mentioned chemistry's dramatic. It's very visually appealing. You can do coloured smoke and fireworks. Is there a way to make diligent, careful, non-exciting science interesting? For example, a passion for steam engines or stamp collecting without there being dramatic. I am going to say I disagree that steam engines are not dramatic. If you go to the Science Museum and see one of those 100-year-old machines running, that is about as dramatic as you can get. But I do understand not everyone can access a 100-year-old steam engine and run it in their front room. So there is something to the argument there. But is there a way to make the more abstract, the more rigorous, or the harder to resource science interesting for people?
Yes, and in just one word, I'll say it's storytelling. Storytelling is by far the most important tool you have, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find a true life story about a steam engine. It can mean in the way that you deliver a lesson on steam engines, that you deliberately set up surprises. So in the way that you explain one part of how the engine works, you can sort of lead it so that the natural conclusion would be A, but in fact, it's B. And those little reversals, because that's really what storytelling is. Storytelling is about unexpected challenges. It's about overcoming obstacles. And all of those things can be woven into a science lesson. And I would say just look for some way to structure it as a story. And even a topic that may at first seem dull can become interesting if it is told in a storytelling format.
Okay. And we've answered that one. Right. I don't know what you were expecting from coming on a Cyber Cafe Sci. As you've probably worked out, they're not really scripted or planned. I'm going to ask now if the audience have any other questions. And if you've got anything you'd like to add or like to say or elaborate on.
Oh, it's been great to talk with you. This is a topic that I never get tired of discussing and learning. And I particularly appreciated what you said about your experience with learning and feeling like it was mostly just here's information until you got to your master's degree, because I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah, I will just add, in the UK, we do master's degrees after bachelor's and before a research degree, a doctorate. So it's they refer to it as level 7 learning, and level 7, the key differentiator between that and the first 6, as a few people have told me, and yet I've had to explain to some people, is that when you hit level 7, you are expected to start contributing to your discipline. And everything before that is you learning about it. So the trick is, when you've got a master's or are getting a doctorate, you are meant to be innovating and developing the discipline. Before that, you're just learning it. And I've had conversations with people doing the same course as me in similar courses where this is never really explained to them. And some of them have come straight out of doing something like a bachelor's and have almost run into a brick wall, because suddenly the way that it all works completely changes.
It's different, yeah.
Here's one. The standard science paper format is authoritative with no challenge, no obstacles, no doubt. That isn't, or is that a story as you'd see it or as you'd tell it?
That is a good question. I will say that I have seen some very good science papers that do use some storytelling but it's subtle, because unfortunately science papers also sort of have this very didactic, they have a certain, what's the word I'm looking for? There's this etiquette of here's how you're supposed to talk in a science paper, and that style of talking is actually not the best for communicating. And I hope that will kind of evolve and become more accessible as we go forward. But I'd say that in this format, the best way to incorporate storytelling is to present the questions that prompted the research. And most good research articles do that. They give context and background. This research is important because, and if you know why it's important and what needs drive the research, then there is kind of a miniature story there. But I will agree with our anonymous attendee here that's, and generally research papers are not engaging stories.
We've got one very relevant to that that's just come in via Facebook. So has the discussion, or the question is, has the discussion covered how science is so important right now around the world? I'm just going to ask you, why or how is science so important right now in particular? Because I think it is, and a lot of people agree, and apparently we're no longer tired of experts. Sorry, that's a UK in joke. But why is it so important to get people involved and passionate about it? Not just to do a lot of science, but to get people interested in it.
Mm-hmm. For me, I would say the most crucial reason is because critical thinking is essential. And critical thinking, the ability to look at something and then, to evaluate, like, is this a good information or not? That's a skill that a lot of people are losing. And the social wars and divides that we're seeing on social media in particular are being exacerbated by that. And I think there's just a desperate need, particularly in the US. I'm sure you're aware of some of the craziness that we've had here during the past several months, but people need to be able to evaluate, and see something and recognize, like, oh, there's some red flags that this may not be accurate information. And I really see science as being one of the main solutions for that, because a lot of it at its base just comes down to the ability to think critically. And that's the heart of science. But then on a broader scale, we have global warming and climate change happening, and more people need to be educated about that. Like, that's a huge need that we have right now.
Bethany, by the way, has just come in on Twitter and said that it's very nice to meet you, and she's definitely up for a botany panel. Sorry, I volunteered you for one, but we'll get that sorted out. From Chris, he loves engaging with science for children, but couldn't maintain it for 52 lessons weekly. How do you remain creative? How do you keep up that enthusiasm long term?
Well, the 52 lessons, and it was daily, Monday through Friday for just over 10 weeks. That was, I'll tell you, that was challenging. The thing that kept us going was actually requests from fans, because by the time that I started thinking, well, I've just gone through my list of all the lessons I had prepared and all the ideas I had, we started getting requests from fans like, what about a lesson on plumbing and how toilets work? And I thought, oh, perfect, that would be fun. And so that was really what kept us going, was that collaborative energy with our viewers who kept giving us excellent suggestions for lessons. But we did need a vacation by the time we got to lesson 52. I was pretty delirious with fatigue.
Just making a note to find a speaker who can talk about the science of toilets. Seriously, if you yes. know someone who could, please point them at me, because that would be fantastic to have. Is critical thinking really hard to include if you're in a formal regulated school teaching environment? And there's a little bit of commentary on the end there saying where the last thing you want is critical.
I'm a big fan of, and it's funny for me to say this because none of my kids have ever gone to an IB school, an international baccalaureate school, but they focus on inquiry-based learning, where you lead by questions, and that format I think is really good. And I hope that more educational programs will adopt inquiry-based learning, because I think it introduces critical thinking at an early age, and then it encourages it throughout the entire process. So that's my short answer there, is to just look at shifting more towards, and Socratic method is another name for that. Yes, to look at shifting more towards that, or incorporating elements of that if you can't do like a full curriculum shift. I think that's a really helpful approach.
I will personally say that while I really admire and love using the Socratic method in meetings, I would not necessarily recommend reading the dialogues. They do read rather like bad fan fiction. They're not as profound as the method itself, let's say.
No, they are. I had a philosophy class where we went through, and it was a lot of work. But inquiry-based learning, I have nothing but good things to say about inquiry-based learning.
Yeah, the comment's been made that Plato was the original fanboy, and I really can't argue with that.
It's true.
Actually, that's one. So again, I'm comparing UK and America, but they're two models we've got. In the UK, you go to university, you pick a subject. You might have some optional modules. So for example, I started off studying physics, and I had a module on medical physics and a module on particle physics, but you are studying a subject. In America, obviously, firstly, you go to college, which is a completely different thing from our college, but let's just call it university. But from what I understand, you've got a much broader base of subjects you can pick from. Now, there's definitely an argument for each one suits different people differently. But do you think there's an inherent advantage either in focusing or on general looking at everything, or looking at a much broader base?
That's a really good question. And I think there are other countries that differentiate really early on, where, by the time you're in 5th grade, your test scores determine whether you're going to go to trade school or to professional school. And I think there are advantages to trying to provide a good, broad, general education to all of your citizens as much as you can. But at the same time, in the US, I feel like our bachelor's degrees, the first degree you get at college, are replacing what a high school diploma used to mean. And now people are being encouraged, if you want to have job security, go on and get a master's and a PhD. And I feel like that trend is just not sustainable in the long term. And yeah, honestly, and this is a little bit of a tangent maybe for a different topic, but I think we need to reevaluate just the purpose of higher education and what we're doing, because I think we're not serving people the best we could in a lot of areas. But that's a whole nother topic.
Another one. If you could only instill one, would you choose inquiry or facts, and why?
Oh, that is a really good question. I would choose inquiry. So if I had a child and I could only choose to either, and I'm going to interpret this, I could only choose to teach them how to ask questions, or I could give them facts to know, I would choose to teach them how to ask questions, because I think that would eventually lead them to the knowledge that they needed. But if I was just delivering facts and they did not have the ability to evaluate and ask the right questions, then I don't think those facts would be very useful.
Okay, so on questions then, are there stupid questions?
It all depends. It all depends. I would say, for the most part, no. And I guess it depends on like why the question is being asked, but yeah, especially coming from a child, there's no such thing as a stupid question.
Right. Oh, okay. And oh no, that's a very interesting one. So I'm going to do a personal ranty bit again. I've been making this argument for a while that a lot of the time, certainly in my field, there isn't the need to learn things. You don't need to learn how to do something because you can look it up, it's available. The question that's come in is, do you think the ready availability of fact, for example, online, will make it even less of a priority?
This is a fascinating question, and I think it's going to become even more pertinent in the next decade as artificial intelligence continues to make headway and improvements. And I think it kind of gets back to what we talked about earlier with scientific thinking and the whole purpose of education. It's not just to know facts, it's to understand how to evaluate information and which information is important. And anonymous attendee says, and what about after the apocalypse? We'll find out, I suppose.
I'm just going to point out I've got several Kindles already preloaded with books like The Knowledge. I've got solar panels and I've got the actual physical books. So after the apocalypse, feel free to pop round. Might be a long swim for some people, but no, we have still got the facts available. We can sort it one way or another.
In math in particular, there's been an interesting change in the way it's instructed, because calculators are so omnipresent now, the ability to crunch numbers and do basic multiplication to a lot of students just seems useless because, I have a calculator that could do that for me. And my husband, being a math professor at a university here, on all the tests, you can use a calculator. A calculator is fine. The more important thing is, what are you going to do with the calculator? Can you use it to solve problems? That's kind of what the emphasis is now.
So I remember hearing about this from someone who was good at maths, that they were awful at mental arithmetic and didn't really care about numbers because they never used them. It was letters. Whole thing built around that. And on maths, I'm teaching my grandchildren maths where there are a lot of facts that you need to understand. Do you sometimes need to teach some facts, or should you find a more interesting way?
There are certain fields, and to get back to the multiplication facts, my husband, although in his mathematics class, the students can use a calculator and they really don't need to know their times tables. For our children, that's been really important to him, to make sure that they're very comfortable with their addition facts and their multiplication facts, because it's kind of analogous to reading. If you can read well, you're going to enjoy reading books. But if sounding out every single word is a struggle, then reading a book becomes a really daunting task. And so in mathematics, I think there are certain facts that lay a base work where you can try and make it fun by including games, but a lot of it is just going to be drills. Like, you need to practice those skills, you need to drill, and you do need to do some, here's a fact, make sure that you know it. There is some of that involved, particularly in mathematics in the early stages, because you need to understand the number line of those basic facts before you can get on to the more interesting stuff.
I remember reading a while ago about the Trachtenberg system of mathematics. It's a load of shortcuts and tricks and so on that work for a lot of mental arithmetic. So you can just do it in a snap because you know a rule, you know a shortcut.
Yeah.
I've not seen any actual research into it, but there were some anecdotes around it saying that teaching children these made them enjoy maths because they could do it, and then they could learn to understand it once they could do the tricks and so on around it. I don't know if that's got any sort of parallels. It probably has, and I also don't know if the bit I read has any accuracy or any data behind it at all. So right, scientists are notoriously bad programmers. I can attest to that, in that they do not know or follow good established practices, organization, and particularly documentation, though they can hack out code eventually. Do you think things like programming literacy, so style, concision, efficiency, readability, may become a part of science education, and should they?
That is a great question. I think that programming literacy, just and particularly organization, like how you organize information, I think that's an important part of all types of science. But in terms of programming, I will say I feel like there are two types of programmers. I have a couple good friends, including my brother is a programmer, and there are those who just like to hack. Hackers. There are those who it doesn't matter if the code looks terrible as long as it works. They're happy with it. And then there are more delicate programmers who really like to have it read well and be beautiful code. And I think there's room in the world for both. You can have both types of programmers. It doesn't need to be one or the other. And maybe I'm saying that just because my brother is a total hack. And
I was going to say, I'm going to fundamentally disagree with that, because I have to pick up other people's code, and I don't think there is any room in the world for people who write code I can't read easily. But that's a personal opinion. Right, we've had a lot of questions. Actually, we've hit a very large number. Yeah, we've had questions across various social channels and so on, and it's just after 8 o'clock here in the UK, and obviously I can see that the earth is rising over there.
That's right.
Thank you so much. If there's a sort of finishing comment you'd like to do to wrap up the talk, then now's the time to make it, and then I will take us offline. And those of us in the live Zoom studio audience, if you're willing to stick around a bit, what we've done last time was just bring everyone into the panel to have a general conversation, so we can do that again if you're happy with that.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah, so if you want to do the dramatic wrap up, just get you spotlighted.
All right, not sure how dramatic it will be, but I would like to just end by saying thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation, James. And to those watching, I will say that there has never been more of a need for solid science education, and there have never been more science educators online, particularly with the unknown this next fall with how schools are going to resume and what portion is going to be in person or online. I would say share the word. Not only my own Science Mom channel, but other science educators that you find online. Anytime you see someone who is practicing science education, start to share that with your friends and family. Give it a like, engage on social media, because we really need more science education. And a lot of that is going to be virtual in the next few years. So I'll be doing my part, and I hope that you will do yours to help other people learn how to think critically and have a love for learning.